G'day, I'm Scott Poynton and welcome to another podcast. I want to talk about inspiring change. For those people who have been listening to my podcast over the years, you'll see that in the introduction to the podcast on Spotify or on iTunes, I mentioned this idea, this notion that I have that change happens deep in the hidden recesses of the human heart. This has been my experience over so many years working at the frontier of pretty complex change processes, way back starting in 1999 when I first set up the Tropical Forest Trust, started working on bringing change to the garden furniture sector, which at the time was involved in some pretty nasty human rights abuses. Well, the industry itself wasn't. They were buying logs from forest operations where there were big human rights abuses, lots of forest destruction, illegal logging, a lot of bad things. And I was involved in a process to bring change to that, where we got rid of those sources and we supported people to do good forest management, change the industry. Interesting, fascinating experiences from that time. And that work led on to working in the Congo Basin to help the industry there move towards forest certification and sustainable practices. And then in the palm oil sector, in 2010, working first with Nestle, then with Golden Agri Resources. I think we know Nestle, the world's largest food company. Golden Agri Resources, Indonesia's largest palm oil grower, the second largest palm oil grower in the world. And then later with Wilmar in 2013, the world's largest palm oil company. In between, working with the state-owned teak corporation in Indonesia to remove 4,000 semi-automatic weapons from the hands of the rangers who were protecting the teak forests and regularly shooting people who were involved in illegal logging. And also working with Asia Pulp and Paper, the pariah of the environmental movement at that time, having been attacked for 20 years for linked to big forest destruction in Sumatra and in Kalimantan in Indonesia. All fascinating journeys. And since those sort of peak times of being involved in change processes and supporting people to change, I've done many other smaller projects and a couple of big ones. And right now, working in Ghana on a regenerative agricultural project there, really, with the inspiration of What If Foods, a planet-based food company based in Singapore, looking to bring regenerative agricultural practices to the food industry worldwide, but we're starting with Ghana. And this is all about change and getting people to work in a different way. And that's why I think, I'm so fascinated by this whole notion of change and how we bring change. And after looking back on all of those experiences over so many years, seeing people under all sorts of stress and tensions as NGO campaigns raged against them, and they resisted and they fought and they didn't want to change, but eventually they did. And I was privileged to be involved in a lot of those change processes, sitting in what I call the dark rooms with the leaders of those companies and with the leaders of the NGOs like Greenpeace, like Mighty Earth. NGOs doing great work, raising attention, raising awareness, raising pressure, raising tensions on the company leaders to find paths to change. And none of these paths were simple or straightforward. And what I learned when I looked back, I didn't do a lot of looking back until really around, I would say, 2014, 2015, when one of my colleagues at TFT asked me, he said, so, when has it worked? And when hasn't it worked? He was doing his master's in change. Fascinating master's course he did. And he did his thesis on the whole work that we'd been doing at TFT to bring change into some pretty complex situations. And after many walks in the forest and it's fine when I do my reflection there, it came to me really that, this notion that change happens deep in the hidden recesses of the human heart. It's not a head thing. And I think what happens with a lot of these campaigns of the NGOs, which are much needed, and I'm not critical of these campaigns in any way. Often we need those campaigns. And it's been fascinating to me over the last 5 or so years to see that those campaigns, maybe even more than 5 years, but those campaigns seem to have fallen away. Or maybe I'm just missing them. I don't know. There are still campaigns going on. I know Mighty Earth is campaigning a lot on deforestation, but they just seem to have fallen away a bit. Whereas, through the 90s and 2000s, the early 2010s, this was the modus operandi for NGOs. So they would bring the pressure, and the first reaction from the companies were logical arguments, intellectual arguments, and they just fought against each other. The NGOs came with their arguments, the companies came with their arguments, and nothing much changed. In fact, in some ways it got worse as Companies just doubled down and said, no, these are our forests, or this is our country, we'll do what we like, thanks very much. In some cases, deforestation, illegal logging, human rights abuses accelerated as companies thumbed their nose at the criticism. But as I say, through luck, through being in the right place at the right time, through serendipity, I often talk about the universe. I was very lucky to find myself involved in these very, very complex, very high tension, high conflict change processes. And being pivotal in the room there with the leaders of the companies and helping them through the journey to change. And I talk about the toughest 50 centimetre journey that these people travelled in that change process. It wasn't from stepping from left to right. It was to go from their head down into their gut, down into their intuition, down into their values, into their soul, where they live as people. And when the arguments came really down to that level, none of these company leaders wanted to be linked to the death of orangutans, to human rights abuses, to people being killed. None of them wanted that. And yet it was happening as a result of their business transactions, as a consequence of the way they were doing business. Deforestation was happening. Illegal logging was happening. Human rights abuses were happening. Biodiversity was being destroyed. These were all consequences of the way they were running their business. And when they really got to that level, that connection inside them, and they said, look, we don't want to be linked to that. Their head was telling them that it was hugely profitable, that they were heroes. Society was telling them, they were being rewarded by grand incomes and being put on pedestals as great business leaders. They were driving nice cars, living in nice houses, going on nice holidays, getting good annual bonuses, great salaries. Those were all things for the head. But when it really came down to it, their hearts their souls, their gut, their intuition, that inner wisdom wasn't happy with the way things were going. And what I found is that if we could support people to get down to that place and to see these issues in a very human way, and to forget about profit and loss, quarterly results, all of those matters of the head, and to think about them through their heart, then we could really get somewhere. And it was rather quick. Once they got to that place of all of the intellectual arguments had failed, they weren't making progress. The campaign wasn't going away. Sales were being affected. Customers were leaving. They had to get to the place of being lost. And it was when they were lost that often I was asked to come in and help them navigate their way forward. Fascinating process being in the dark room. They weren't dark, of course, the lights were on, but these are rooms of great confidentiality. And I can't talk about what happened in those rooms, but I can say that in general, when I went in there and we made progress, the leaders were genuinely lost. They didn't know the way out of this situation. And it was by sitting with them and listening to them and talking to them and treating them with respect and compassion, coming in with humility because, hey, who am I to come with all of the answers? I always said to people, I'm not a consultant. I'm not coming here to give you the 10 steps to nirvana. I'm helping you come here and find your own path because they're all obscured by what I call the great fog of the unknown, which had descended upon them. They're in this unknown place where business as usual wasn't cutting it anymore because their customers, NGOs, were attacking them for the way they did their business. But they didn't know how else to do it. And they were lost and they were looking for direction. And a lot of people didn't work with me or with TFT because we didn't come in and say, here's the 10 steps to sorting this problem out. I did have some companies ask me to do that. Come and get the NGOs off our back. And I'm like, well, that's not my job. I can help you on the journey to that place where you're sitting in a room with the NGOs talking with respect and finding a solution to this problem. But if you just want me to protect you from the NGOs and, stand in between you and the NGOs and take their bullets for you, that's not happening. And so some companies say, oh, well, you're pretty useless. We won't work with you. Okay, no problem. When you're ready to travel a deeper journey to true change, come and talk to me because I won't greenwash. I won't rubber stamp what you do. You do need to change and you need to find your own way of doing that. And it wasn't until the company leaders had gone through this process of being angry and indignant, despairing at the horror of the campaign that was run against them, or their customers asking them these tough questions. It wasn't until they finally got to the point where very intelligent people, very good people, but they didn't know what to do. And that's when they spoke to me. And it's that lesson that I learned, is that for anyone to go through any change process, they have to pass through being lost. They must first be lost before they can find their path forward. And so when people were lost, I would literally sit with them and I would talk with them. I might give them a little nudge here or there to suggest possible paths that they could look at, but it wasn't my journey. And I could make it clear to them what the NGOs were asking. I could make it clear to them what their customers were asking, but they sort of knew that. They didn't know how to find their way to that. And by sitting there and being truly who I am as a person, and just listening to them, treating them well, treating them as human beings, not as evil business leaders intent on destroying the planet. Because I never really met anyone like that. I never met a business leader who woke up every day and said, how many people's human rights can we destroy today? I don't doubt that such people exist, but I think they're quite uncommon. I never met anyone who said, oh, how many orangutans can we kill today? It didn't happen. It wasn't their goal, but it was happening as a result of their business. And so they needed to change, but they didn't know how. But they needed to find the way. And my job was to help them get to that place where they could realise that this was happening as a result of their business, and most importantly, that they didn't feel good about it. They didn't want to be boasting about the number of orangutans they killed today. They didn't want that to be hung off their brand, that they were human rights abusers, that they had slave labour in their supply chain, that they were profiting from people's suffering. And that's what I mean when I say that change happens deep in the hidden recesses of the human heart, because when those leaders found their way to that connection, everything changed, and it changed very, very rapidly. And we saw these companies come out with the first ever no deforestation policies. We will not be linked to deforestation. And they invested large amounts of money and continue to invest large amounts of money to implement those policies. We don't want to be linked to exploitation, the exploitation of people. And again, they built up huge teams across their business to ensure this wasn't the case. That's not to say that everything's rosy, that the world is free of slave labour. It isn't. In fact, it's probably getting worse. This just tells us we need more change. And instead of yelling at people, or only yelling at people and telling them how bad they are, we might need more people who can help those leaders take that journey, that 50 centimetre journey from their head to their gut, or to their heart, to their soul, where they realise that that's where change happens, and that they don't want to be linked to suffering and all of those negative things. I often say we don't need more activists. We need more mediators. We need more listeners. We need people who can sit with and wallow in the lostness, who are comfortable in the lostness that these leaders feel, and be with them and listen to them and help them find their way forward, because they know what they need to do deep inside them. They just haven't made that connection. So if we can help them travel that journey to make the connection, change will happen. This is so pertinent now, of course, as we look at what's happening with climate change in the world. What a disaster. Everyone's fighting with each other. Everyone's greenwashing. It reminds me of illegal logging back in forest destruction back in the 90s, 80s, 90s, even the 2000s. 2000 it was getting better. No, that's not true. 2010 it started to get better as companies understood what they needed to do. And it was the pioneering work that we did with companies like Nestle, GAR, APP and Wilmar that identified the path to change. But really in the 80s, 90s and 2000s, there was a huge problem with illegal logging, and there was much greenwashing to try and pass the buck to someone else and to pretend that people weren't involved in it. It's exactly the same with climate change today. So, we can look forward, I hope, to more serious action. The problem with climate change is that it is upon us now and the impacts are so huge. So we really need change to accelerate. And that is a bit of a problem, because that journey from head to heart to soul is a challenging one for people. And it's not one that can be easily rushed. But that's where we come in as change makers. We can help people hold their hand through that journey so leaders can cross those bridges much more quickly than they have in the past, and we can start to see change unfold. It's very important to me, very important subject to me, to start sharing the lessons that I've learned over these, so many years now, more than 2 decades of working at the frontier of these complex change processes. I do want to share these experiences. I've set up a community called A Different Way. My company's called A Different Way community, where inside the community we try and start discussions around how do we bring change. Training courses in there about how to bring change. How do we inspire change? How do we inspire people to make that journey to their heart? If you're interested in that, just search A Different Way community and you'll find information about that community on the website there. You're welcome to join. And to finish up really this podcast, I just wanted to share with you some wise words. It's a funny thing that we sometimes need global leaders to tell us things before they resonate with us and before we listen. And I'm certainly not one of those global leaders. But I found some words the other day in an article that quoted Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall, I think she's turning 89 this year. What an amazing soul, an amazing person who's been involved in so many great projects, great work to make the world a better place. And she was quoted as talking about change. I'm just going to read that out for you. The last paragraph in particular is very powerful. But she says this: changing attitudes depends partly on alleviating ignorance so that people truly understand what's going on in the world today, Goodall said. It is also enabling people to get the education they need, to get enough money to make ethical choices. So again, it's complete interrelated mixture. The final layer to finding a solution to the mounting pressures of climate change, Goodall said, is human connection. Whether in the form of stories or conversations, that's how people's minds are changed. And this is the important paragraph for me. And she says, when you're trying to change people's minds, you have to reach their hearts. If it's really going to make a difference, they need to change from within. And I have found the best way to plant seeds of change within people is to tell stories. Tell a story that can actually reach their heart. And I loved those words, particularly that last paragraph about reaching people's heart, because it really did resonate with my own experience. And I really feel that it isn't about changing people's minds. Everyone talks about, and even Jane talks about changing people's minds. I don't feel it's about changing anyone's mind. Who am I to change anyone's mind? What I think is the broader problem here is a lack of connection between the mind and the soul, the mind and the heart. We've built a disconnection there as we celebrate the smartest person in the room, where we define smart as being, the most wealthy or the most successful. These are the people that are celebrated. We place much benefit, much onus in our education system on the people who get the greatest marks. We celebrate rich intellect. And yet that intellect can be involved in bad things, not necessarily because it means to be, but because that intellect is the most efficient at converting a forest into a palm oil plantation, or doing anything with a natural resource, for example. It's the most efficient at converting oil into energy. And so those companies make the most money, they make the most success. So we celebrate those things, those intellectual things. So I don't think it's about mind. I think the reality is that our minds have come disconnected from who we are as people, from our inner wisdom, from our soul, from our wild nature-based self. And my work has really told me that the journey to change happens not through the mind, but it's when the mind gets connected to the soul, and then the soul and the inner wisdom, the nature of people starts guiding them, and then the mind becomes secondary to that and actually helps them travel that path faster. We need our minds. People sometimes say, you're saying that, we shouldn't use our intellect. No, not at all. But I do say, feel first, then think. Feel what you should do. Does it feel right if you're involved in human rights abuses, if you're involved in deforestation, activities that lead to climate change? The world is in such a dire place. Is that okay? How does that feel? A lot of people are in denial, and that's why we need those NGO campaigns to break that cycle of denial. You are involved in these things. We are linked to these bad practices every time we go to the shop and buy something. How does that feel? And when you feel it viscerally inside that you don't want to be linked to those things anymore, you use your great intellect, you use your mind to move away from them. So that's what I mean when I say feel first, then think. And I think the barrier to change is not trying to change people's minds. It's trying to get them to make that 50 centimetre journey, the toughest journey, the most important journey that they can make and that we need people to make, is from the primacy of our oversized human brains to the beauty and connectedness of our hearts and our souls within. Unfortunately, sitting around about our chest in so many people is a steel reinforced concrete block. And it's that we've got to navigate. It's that we've got to break through so that people find their way to that connection. And if we can do that, we can indeed inspire change at great pace and at great scale. And I believe in a way that can help us minimise and move beyond the terrible unfolding tragedy of climate change that is upon us right now. We've got a lot of bad ahead of us, but if more of us can find that connection to that inner wisdom within us, I think we can find a way forward. Those are my thoughts today. I do want to talk more practically about how we actually do that. That's what the Different Way community is for. But for now, just invite you to ponder that thought shared by Jane Goodall, shared by my experience, resonates so much with my experience of helping people find connection to their heart. I'm Scott Poynton. Thanks very much.